There may not have been a more revolutionary invention during the 19th century than the steam locomotive. They provided an efficient means of mass transportation for the very first time. But in many ways, they felt just as alive as a fellow human being. Every locomotive had a personality, and they also had a voice. A voice that many found comforting, but also served a purpose. Many took pride in such a voice, although none could say they had more pride than the Southern Railway. In this video, we will be discussing every type of Southern Railway whistle, from the shortest of single chimes to the tallest of 6 chimes, and everything in between. We'll be discussing the shop-built, the mass-marketed, and some you may have never known were used on the Southern. We'll also discuss how they were built, what they were built for, the rough measurements, do they sound good? Where might you be able to hear one today? All of that and more coming up as we discuss the whistles of the Southern Railway. So before we begin, let me get a few things straight. I'm not going to be talking about what whistles are generally used for or the science of how they work. If you guys want to learn more about that, I'll leave 2 videos in the description by our good friend Mark Huber, also known as Heis. And he gets into the general science of how whistles work, and also the general knowledge of how railroad whistles are used on a daily basis. I'm going to be talking about the different whistle types, what they were designed for, how common they were, and if there are any left in preservation that you might be able to hear. Also, there was very little standardization on steam locomotives, let alone whistles. The shop crews and locomotive engineers back in the steam era did, as I quote from a friend of mine, anything to everything in order to make whistles work. Name any modification, and I'm sure someone has tried it. Larger and smaller inlets in order to give a whistle more or less volume, gutted valves in order to use a separate valve, added parts to make a whistle work or sound different, hybrid parts to make a whistle work, sound better, or sound more unique, modified chambers on the inside or outside to make a whistle sound different, stampings or pattern numbers to show who or where something came from, other cosmetic changes, and I'm sure there's more. When I talk about these whistles, these are what I mostly consider to be the standard or what these whistles were intended to be. But of course, there are always exceptions. Also, as far as when these whistles were made, there are parts and markings that make a whistle an early or later variant, but as far as an exact date on when these were built, they are a complete shot in the dark. Also, for measuring the bells, my measurements are from the bottom edge of the chamber to the top of the chamber, not the edge of the bowl to the top of the chamber. Just note that the gap between the bowl and the bottom of the bell can vary, so in measuring the height of the bell, I don't count that gap. So now, with all that out of the way, let's begin the episode with the single chimes or hooter whistles. The first one we'll take a look at is the high-tone hooter, or the Banshee. So these whistles were 5 inches in diameter, the bells were round top, and ranged anything from to 5 inches tall, and most of them were made of brass. Now almost all Southern Railway whistles were built with poppet-style valves, and the activation levers were located on top of the center rod. The push rod between these two travels through the center rod, and the bowl has an inlet with 2-inch pipe threads. Also, I must mention, all the hooters on the Southern are typically referred to as bootlegs, and we all know what the term bootleg means. These were actually some of the most common whistles you could find on the Southern back in the steam era. They were used mostly on freight trains because of the ear-piercing high-pitched screaming tone, and they do not sound good compared to the whistles coming up. However, they got the job done. Like I said before, there's not a lot of these in preservation, but they are not the rarest whistle in the world. Although, of the hooters we'll cover today, they are indeed the rarest. There's not a common place to hear this type of whistle, but any type of whistle pops up from time to time. Here's a clip of one of the Banshees being blown at 160 psi. The next one we'll look at is the 8-inch tall bootleg hooter. These whistles were once again 5 inches in diameter and were equipped with poppet valves and top levers. The bells were round top and most were made of brass. However, they were 8 inches tall. The taller bell creates a deeper tone that is not as piercing to the ear. While these were still mostly used on freight trains, they were not as obnoxious as the Banshee. Speaking of, sometimes the bells and center rods on these were machined down to make a Banshee. Anyway, the 8-inch hooters were also very common on the Southern, and there are quite a few in preservation. Although there is not a common place to see one of these in action, every now and then one can pop up. In particular, 2 were used recently at the annual Ravenna Whistleblow event at the Kentucky Steam Heritage Corporation. I'll play the early version first, then I'll play the later version, both of which are being blown at 160 psi. The next one we'll take a look at is the 12-inch tall bootleg hooter. Once again, these were 5 inches in diameter and equipped with poppet valves and top levers. However, most of the 12-inch tall bells were flat top and made of cast iron. Just like the previous bootlegs, they were mainly used on freight trains and were some of the most common whistles on the Southern Railway. Fun fact, this type of whistle was the original voice of the ever-popular Southern 630. Their haunting deep tone and ability to squeak easily made these whistles truly memorable. Just like the other bootlegs, there's not a common place to find one, but one did show up at Ravenna. However, one of the most popular ones is the one at the Cass Scenic Railroad. The one used at Cass has the valve gutted to make it usable on a separate Lunkenheimer whistle valve. Also, the whistle has a hybrid cap. Like I said before, hybrid parts were very common in the industry. Here are 2 12-inch Southern bootleg hooters on 160 and 200 psi. we're going to move into the chime whistles. Chime whistles, of course, have more than one note. Also, none of the whistles that are going to be mentioned at this point forward are going to be referred to as bootlegs. We'll start with the 3 chimes. The first ones we'll talk about are the Crosby 3 chimes. So Crosby was a whistle manufacturer located in Boston, Massachusetts, and they were very famous for their 3 chime whistles. Now, if you like this video, we can touch upon the Crosby Company in the future, although they were common enough on the Southern that they deserve to be briefly mentioned. One thing that makes the Crosby whistle stand out on the Southern is a modification the railroad made to some of the valves. The poppets on some of the horizontal style valves were removed, then the valves were drilled and modified to receive a poppet with a larger valve stem. It's not known exactly why they were modified, but I would assume it was for durability and ease of fabrication. If you've ever operated a lathe before, you know the feeling. And in the preservation era, 2 were given washers to keep from squealing. Although aside from small issues, pretty much all Crosby 3 chime whistles as a whole work and sound really good. There are 2 types of Crosby whistles that were used on the Southern that we know of, those being 5-inch diameter ones and 6-inch diameter ones. The 5-inch ones were usually used on the smaller locomotives, usually because they do not put out as much steam pressure, and in my opinion their higher tone fits them better. The most famous example of one of these was used on Southern Railway 280, number 154. The 6-inch diameter ones were used on everything big and small. Everything from switchers to even the massive 2882s. A common place to find one of these in preservation is at the Tweedsea Railroad theme park in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, and has been since she first arrived at the park in 1960. 190s has both a washer and a poppet with a larger valve stem. We'll play both 190s and 154s, and 2 examples without washers that also came from the Southern. Here's both the 5-inch and 6-inch diameter Crosby 3 chimes blown at 150 to 185 psi. The next one we'll take a look at is my personal favorite of the shop-built whistles, and that is the step-top 3 chime. So the step-top 3 chimes were 6 inches in diameter. The tallest note was roughly... They had poppet-style valves and top levers, and were once again made of brass. There were cast iron versions made, although they were not as common. There was also a 5-inch diameter variant as well, although this version was an early variant. The way you can tell is the design of the bowl. Compare that to the early bootlegs. Very similar. I won't talk about this variant very long, but I'll gloss over the one on your screen right now. The most famous example of this variant was used on Kentucky and Tennessee Railway number 10. L.C. Bruce, the master mechanic of the K&T, was a former employee of the Southern, and he probably brought the whistle with him to the K&T and put it on the 10. Not confirmed, but possible. It was used a few times at Ravenna, and here's a clip of it blown at 160 psi. Back to the 6-inch variants. So most of these whistles were cast by the Lenoir City shops located in Lenoir City, Tennessee. When they were cast, they were sent to whichever shop ordered them, and they were machined at the location ordered. A lot of times, the shops that ordered them stamped their location in the whistle. The Princeton shops in Indiana were very famous for doing this. Now again, these were mostly used on freight trains, but they were passable if they were ever needed on passenger trains. They have a pretty tone, and depending on the way the shop machined them, sometimes they were very high and shrill, and some were a little deeper and more mellow. Either way, they were some of the best sounding whistles on the Southern. This type of whistle was, and still is, the voice of the world famous Southern Railway 282, number 4501. Hers has the Princeton shop stamped on it, and was slightly modified at some point in the past. One of these whistles was also the common voice of Rebel Railroad, now Dollywood Express number 192, for many years. 2 raw ones that can be heard in preservation can be found on 2 former Southern Railway steamers. Moorhead and North Fork 060 number 12, which was formerly Southern Railway number 1643, and Southern Railway 280 number 401 both regularly carry this type of whistle. In fact, 12 also had one of these on the Southern. I'll play 2 clips of 6 different ones I've captured over the years, including 4501, 12, and 401. Here are 6 Southern step-top 3 chimes being blown at 150 to 210 psi. I'll also mention these are some of the most replicated whistles on the planet. MD Whistles and Rosali Locomotive Works, among others, have built countless replicas of these whistles. Here's a steel one being blown at 225 psi. The next one we'll talk about is the long bell 3-chime. So the origin of these whistles actually start with another whistle. At some point, the Southern Railway wanted a deep whistle for their passenger trains. So at first, they built an 8-inch diameter whistle that looked and sounded very similar to the 8-inch diameter Crosby 3-chimes. It's rumored that Crosby filed a lawsuit for patent infringement, however, there's no way to prove that. Whether Crosby had a hand in it or it just didn't sound good, not many were made, and as far as I know, none were used in preservation. So instead of building another 8-inch whistle, they decided to make a 6-inch diameter whistle similar to those used on the Illinois Central Railroad. The main difference is that the IC whistles were 6.5 inches in diameter rather than 6, giving the Southern whistles an ever so slightly higher tone. Anyway, these whistles were 6 inches in diameter, the tallest note was, and they were usually equipped with poppet-style valves and top levers. Because of their taller chambers, these provided a much deeper tone compared to the step-top ones. As a result, these are the least ear-piercing, and therefore mostly used on passenger trains. However, a lot of them were used on freight trains as well. Of all the whistles you have and will see on this video, these are indeed the most famous of all the Southern Railway whistles. A lot of these were used on the T-Class 482s, however, the slang term for these is the PS4 whistle. The reason for it is because a lot of the famous PS4 Pacifics had these whistles. This was, in fact, number 1401's original voice, which she still carries, I might add. And she's on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The Virginia and Southwestern Railroad had a couple of these bells, and they are stamped to differentiate from their southern counterparts. They are the same design, with only minor differences. The Virginia Southwestern was later bought by the Southern in 1906. Back to the Southern ones, these are the most celebrated on the Southern Railway, and in preservation. As a result, not many have been on steam and let alone seen the sun in years. So of course, there is no common place to hear one of these, although they have been used from time to time. A couple have been used at Ravenna. The Virginia and Southwestern variant is used every now and then on Southern 630 and 4501 at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, and one was used very recently at the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad on former Chesapeake and Ohio 2662 number 1309. Here are 6 clips of these whistles being blown at 160 to 210 psi, and the Virginia and Southwestern variant being blown at 205 psi. will also mention that these were also very popular to replicate, but not on the same level as the step top. One in particular was used for a few years on Great Smoky Mountains Railroad number 1702. It's not known if Southern ever had a 4-chime, but if one was used, it wasn't very popular. Now we transition over to the 5-chime whistles. So the information on how the 5 chimes were built is unclear, but I'll provide all the information that I could gather. So the 5 chimes were 6 inches in diameter, had poppet valves and top levers, and were loosely based off of a star brass 5 chime similar to those used by the Union Pacific, with the exception of having a taller deep note and being made of cast iron. So these and the next type of whistle were indeed the rarest of all the common whistles on the Southern. They were definitely shrill, although I couldn't decide if these were high or low. They are slightly higher than your typical 5 chime, but they are also lower than a star brass one. Regardless of the opinions, only a few were made and were rather unpopular. However, the few that were made were used for both freight and passenger trains. Now, as far as preservation, these are some of the rarest Southern Railway pieces in existence, so very few and far between have been used on steam. However, we were lucky enough to capture one example and a steel replica. The original was used on Southern Railway 154, and the steel replica was used on Great Smoky Mountains Railroad number 1702. Here are both 5 chimes on 150 and 225 psi. The last of the common whistles we'll talk about is the 6 chimes. Now there are 2 variants, but I'll start with the step-top whistles. So the step-top variants were originally built by the Georgia Southern and Florida Railroad. They were 6 inches in diameter, had poppet valves and top levers, the tallest chamber was roughly 12 inches tall, and the bells were made of cast iron. Back to the origin story, the Georgia Southern in Florida ran between Macon, Georgia and Palatka, Florida, which is about 60 miles south of Jacksonville. In 1895, they were reorganized after bankruptcy, and they ended up being controlled by the Southern. So naturally, some of these wound up on the Southern. It's not known if the Southern cast any, but like the 5 chimes, they were not as popular as their 3 chimes. They were a little higher than your typical 6 chime, but not as shrill as the 5 chimes, and generally had a better tone. Because a lot of these were from the GS&F, they were mostly used on older locomotives. However, they did find use on both freight and passenger trains. At least one example apparently found its way on the Central Georgia Railroad. So sometimes a slang term used for these are either Southern 6s or Central Georgia 6s. Although the proper term I will use is the Georgia Southern and Florida 6s. As far as preservation is concerned, like the 5 chimes, there are very few of these found in preservation. Naturally, there is not a common place to hear one of these, but there have been at least 3 used on steam in the 21st century. However, of the few left, we did catch one at Ravenna. There was also a steel replica used on Great Smoky Mountains Railroad number 1702. Here is the Georgia Southern and Florida 6 chime being blown at 160 psi, and the steel replica being blown at 225 psi. The other variant of 6 chimes is the boiler tube or Casey Jones type. So this type involved taking a bell off of the center rod and attaching usually 6 or sometimes 7 tubes around the languid plate. The engineer or shop foreman would then cut the tubes down to the desired length and then weld or braze them to the center rod. And of course, one of these belonged to Casey Jones. However, the southern variants are a little harder to pinpoint, and the few found in preservation I've seen sound exactly like the step-top ones. They mostly use the poppet valves and top levers as per usual, but the sound varies depending on the length of the tube. I do not have an audio clip of these, but like I said, the few I've seen sound similar to the step-top ones. Alright folks, that was it for the common whistles on the Southern. Now I will talk about the odd ones out and the rarities of Southern Railway whistles. The first ones we'll talk about are whistles made by locomotive builders. Whistles that were supplied by the manufacturer that a railroad ordered locomotives from. 3 such companies as an example include Alco, Baldwin, and Lima. I'll briefly talk about these 3 companies, but if you like this video, we can touch upon them another day. There may not have been a whistle supplied to every locomotive ordered by the Southern, but there are some photos that suggest there were quite a few. Lima is the odd one out. They did not have many locomotives built for the Southern, but there were a few, including Southern's only Shay. The Shay supposedly was fitted at first with a 5-inch diameter 5 chime when built, and one is regularly used on Sierra Railway number 3. The rod engines could have been delivered with 6-inch variants, which I could not find an original to pinpoint, although there are replicas out there. There is of course no record of Southern using these, but it's definitely possible. As a result, none that I know of exist in preservation. There are pictures of Southern locomotives with Alco 5 chimes, albeit mostly older locomotives. There are a couple used on occasion, but none from the Southern survive that I know of. Baldwin, of course, had 3 different types of whistles, and there is a picture of one Southern locomotive with an early type Baldwin 3 chime. No Baldwin whistle from the Southern exists that I know of, but Baldwin whistles are found all over the country. An early type Baldwin 3 chime can be heard on Virginia and Truckee number 25 at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. There are a couple other mass-marketed whistles that were rare on the Southern, but did exist via stamping and historic photos. The first one we'll talk about is the Lunkenheimer 3 chime. Lunkenheimer, like Crosby, made whistles and other steam accessories for locomotives, and they still exist to this day, although whistles are not the priority anymore. There was at least one Lunkenheimer used on the Southern, and there are a few photographs of one being used on a 460. Here is a similar one being used at the Cass Scenic Railroad at 200 psi. There was a Lonergan 3 chime on the Southern as well, and while I do not have a clip on me, the one from the Southern was used at Ravenna a few years ago. The most unique of all the mass-marketed whistles that recently surfaced was a flat-top Powell 3 chime. Powell is of course famous for their round-top 3 chimes, but in the late 1890s they made a few flat-top 3 chimes similar to the Crosby whistles at the time. Again, like Crosby, at some point down the line, if you want to, we can touch on the Powell Company. One was used on the Southern Railway, and we have proof via the name of the engineer stamped on the whistle. This whistle was briefly at the Cass Scenic Railroad, and we were lucky to have captured a video of it when it was there. Here it is blown at 200 psi. The last mass-marketed whistle we'll talk about is the Hancock Short Bell 3 chime. If you want me to talk more about the Hancock Company, stay tuned for the second installment of this series on whistles. The only thing I'll say about this whistle is one was used on the Southern, and someone modified it to be a top-levered whistle. And the only way I found out about it was someone tested it on Steam a few years ago. There's not much information on Southern using whistles from Ashton, Nathan, Star Brass, or other companies, but if they were used, they were few and far between. So if you know about Southern Railway using a whistle from any company that I didn't mention, let me know in the comments below. The last whistle we'll mention is the 8-inch Crosby knockoff. I talked about these when I talked about the Southern Long Bell 3 chimes, but I of course talked about it and then moved on. There's not an example of this type in preservation that I know of, but many 8-inch Crosby whistles have been used. Here is one that closely resembled the Southern one being blown at 160 psi. Well, if you made it this far, that was almost every type of Southern Railway whistle. Hopefully you learned something today, and in our next installment of this series, we will talk about the Hancock Company, which will be a lot of fun. Thank you for watching. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, share with a friend, and let me know in the comments which type was your favorite. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you next time.